Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ACOM seminar today. Today, our speaker is Dr. Christa Hasenkopf, who is the Director of the Air Quality Programs at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. Her career has focused on efforts that open up information, resources, and networks so that more people in more places can bring clean air to their communities through research, policy, and advocacy. Previously, she co-founded and was the CEO of OpenAQ, an environmental tech nonprofit which fosters a global resource of open air quality information generated by governments. She's also served as the first chief air pollution advisor at the medical director at the U.S. Department of State and in multiple roles at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Currently, Christa also serves as an elected trustee at the Pennsylvania State University and on the board of directors for the nonprofit, the Open Environmental Data Project. Christa received a PhD in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences here at the University of Colorado and a bachelor's in Astronomy and Astrophysics from Penn State. Today, Christa will be speaking about bringing the golden opportunity for filling PM2.5 data gaps into focus. And before starting, I'd like to remind people following online that you can enter your questions in the space below the video at any time during the talk. And at the end of the presentation, I will read those questions to Christa. And with that, Christa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Cal. Really appreciate it. I'm incredibly excited to talk to you all and to be invited to discuss the truly golden opportunities for filling PM2.5 data gaps across the world. It's something that's been on my mind for several years, and the truth is I know it's been on many of your all's minds as well, as evidence from any conference I think I've gone to in the past 10 or 15 years where the global PM2.5 data landscape is mentioned. It's brought up that there are huge gaps in that space. And you know, that's a problem that's impeding a variety of different aspects of air quality research. It impacts satellite-derived estimates of satellite-derived PM2.5 ground measurements, EPI studies, and a slew of other ways in which we're able to understand our own field. It's a problem that has a solution. And so that's what I'd like to discuss today. The background of this is that the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, where I work very remotely from Munich, Germany, we're working on building a report for release at the end of this year to assess two things. One, where are the biggest opportunities to fill gaps in country-level PM2.5 monitoring? And two, who are the local actors best suited to filling those gaps? And the goal of the report is to motivate and provide a real clear strategy to those with means to support actually filling those gaps. And by those with means, I mean groups with scientific or technical resources like many of you, philanthropic resources, because this will take funding, or other resources. And my goal for this talk is to present our preliminary findings for this report so far, get feedback, and also ask your help in finding more interested local actors in who can possibly fill the PM2.5 data gap, or who are already doing that work, but may fly under the radar of the international community to a large degree. So before I get started, I want to introduce the AQ Data Gaps Report team that I'm working with. You can see that Farah, Polash, and Nishka and myself are located across the world, and there's a wide variety of skill sets that we bring, from air quality science to community management and working with communities to achieve clean air or environmental objectives, as well as data analysis, and also some expertise in actual funding and good funding practices. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the funding for this report from Open Philanthropy. And so here's a quick outline of the talk. So first, we'll discuss the mismatch between global PM2.5's health burden and the resources that are collectively deployed to address that issue. We'll talk about the case for why it's so compelling to fill PM2.5 data gaps at the country level across the world. And then we'll talk about how we're currently trying to define these country-sized golden opportunities. And we'll also discuss who can fill this data gap. So we'll talk about our findings so far in engaging local actors across the world. And then we'll end with some next steps and a call to action for all of you listening. So some level setting that I think will be very familiar to many of you in the audience on the global impact of PM2.5 pollution and really this outsized impact that it has on our global health. So from the 2020 State of Global Air Report from the Health Effects Institute, we find 7% of all deaths were attributable on the planet were attributable to PM2.5 pollution in 2019, making it the largest environmental risk factor and fourth overall for mortality. Recently, our air quality programs at EPIC released a report a little over a month ago that showed the impact of various threats to life expectancy. And here you can see the life years lost or average life expectancy lost for these different threats. And you can see PM2.5 relative to the WHO guideline takes about 2.3 years off of global life expectancy. And you can compare that to, say, transport injuries, HIV/AIDS, malaria, nutritional deficiencies, and you can combine all of these, and that's still less than the impact of PM2.5. And something we'll dive into very shortly is there's also a huge funding mismatch. So there's a global fund for important issues like malaria and HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis, which isn't shown on here, that annually devotes $4 billion USD to the issue. Meanwhile, there's no such fund that exists for PM2.5. To put a very fine point on it, the funding pie is extraordinarily small for outdoor air pollution broadly, and certainly for PM2.5 pollution as an issue. So less than $64 million goes towards outdoor air pollution issues from philanthropies worldwide. That's truly a drop in the bucket. As a sense of comparison, this is about the same amount in coins Americans are estimated to throw out each year. And I think as additional context and a truly staggering stat, of that 64 million that goes towards outdoor air pollution issues, the entire continent of Africa receives less than 300,000 USD from, again, philanthropic, specifically philanthropic from foundation money towards the issue annually. And since this is a talk for NCAR, for those of you in Boulder, this is 3 times less than the average cost of a single family house in Boulder. I think that's staggering. So to put it in context, where is the air pollution health burden specifically from PM2.5 versus where are those resources deployed to address air pollution? You can see this figure. So here you see the regional share of all life years lost due to PM2.5 globally as a percentage of total global burden. You can see Asia and Africa in the large bar at 92.5%. And then you can see Europe, US, and Canada at a much smaller level. And you'll see this dark red portion, that's Asia and Africa, not including India and China, just the burden for everywhere minus India and China and Asia and Africa. So that's the burden. Let's look at some resources. So for example, access to fully open air quality data. You see this exactly flipped. So you see a fraction, Asia and Africa, that have fully open air quality data produced by governments within their country. Meanwhile, Europe, US, and Canada, the vast majority of those countries do have that access. And then if you look at pure monetary resources, so this is the regional share of all philanthropic funding for air quality in outdoor air quality in 2021. And so here you see Asia and Africa and the total funding it gets, and then the majority of the funding goes towards Europe, US, and Canada. And I've put in dark red again the portion that it does not include India and China for Asia and Africa, and you can see that tiny sliver. So this is exactly the opposite of if the burden is exactly opposite of how you would think to deploy those resources to address that burden. And if you look at resource and national policies as a resource, or say PM2.5 annual average standards as a resource or good to fight air pollution, and look at where that is lacking, you get this figure. So this shows where there's no PM2.5 standard according to several sources and also our own compilation at EPIC. But I will call out there's no authoritative or definitive source for this information. So if you notice errors like any of this presentation, please do let us know. But the point is, you can see that across Latin America, across the entire continent virtually of Africa, Central Asia, and South Asia, there's a big standards or policy gap. And really between the last slide and this one, in general, you see just this profound gap between where the burden of air pollution is, especially PM2.5 pollution, and where we're deploying different types of resources to address the problem. So then moving on to why it makes a lot of sense to address the issue of PM2.5 pollution in multiple ways, but especially around data gaps, how that's really low-hanging fruit to go after. So first of all, what do we mean by air quality data gaps or PM2.5 data gaps? Well, this figure shows where there's government monitoring and air quality data broadly for outdoor ambient ground monitoring as compiled by OpenAQ in a report they put out last year. And so what you see in dark orange are the 76 countries where there's not evidence for government air quality monitoring. And then in light orange, you see 75 countries where there's a lack of data availability. So this might mean that there's known government data being produced, but it's not accessible as far as one can see publicly, or it might mean that that data is shared, but perhaps not in a fully open way as defined by OpenAQ in this report. And then you'll see 47 countries where the data is fully open and produced by the government. And so you'll see similar gaps that we saw on the slide showing the national standards, where again, especially across, say, the entire continent of Africa, there's a big data gap issue in terms of sustained production and access to government-produced data. And similarly, you see gaps in Latin America, some in Central Asia again, and then some in South and Southeast Asia. So we're going to do a couple thought experiments. The first one is we're going to imagine what a national level impact could be for a small sustained PM2.5 monitoring effort. But before we do that, let's just run through some stats and also some case studies around that. So for national level impact, there was an interesting study done more than 10 years ago now by Candice Balsing and Kirk Smith that looked at the ambient air quality standards in 93 countries. And it found that air quality monitoring data was used the most often to establish or revise ambient air quality standards in various places, showing the role that air quality monitoring data really, the pivotal role really that it plays in building the air quality infrastructure, the air quality management infrastructure in a given country. And it also noted that this was followed by environmental epidemiology studies, which in part often rely on that air quality monitoring data to exist too. And so diving into a couple case studies of where a small monitoring effort had an outsized impact at the national level. One of the first ones that comes to mind is China. And many of you may be familiar with this story, but essentially the US Embassy put a PM2.5, they put a BAM on the embassy roof that put out PM2.5 data, and they put out the information on Twitter. And so here's a couple of headlines that followed in years later after this from Grist, how the US Embassy used Twitter to clear China's air. From Science, rooftop sensors on US embassies after the program expanded are warning the world about crazy bad air pollution. In truth, the US Embassy put the monitor on the roof not to clear China's air, but frankly as a legal issue to provide the same information that they felt bound by, provide the same information to the American public in Beijing that they were providing to their own employees. And as it happened, when they were programming the instrument to share its information on Twitter, they were using EPA guidelines. Well, they got to a level as they were programming the Twitter notes, the tweets. They were programming, and they realized that at a certain level that was above what they thought was reasonable that they would ever reach for air pollution levels, for PM2.5 levels. They called it crazy bad. Well, as it happened, there were some crazy bad air quality levels that happened in Beijing in 2011 and 2012. And crazy bad was tweeted out somewhat incidentally. This created a huge outcry from the Beijing community. In addition, the data that was generated and shared on Twitter was easily scrapable by third-party app developers. So suddenly, in addition to Chinese data that was also out, this information was getting put in the form of apps that were being accessed by millions of Beijingers. And in addition, there was Chinese data that was shared as well. It was in a different form, a slightly different form with different AQIs. And this, even just comparing the two, was causing more scrutiny on what does it mean for the data to be open? What does it mean for the data to have access to that physical underlying data for either of these cases, and really helped build some momentum for clean air action in China. I would not say it was the single effort at all that pushed for policy change in China, but I would say it was an accelerant well worth the cost of a BAM on the roof of an embassy. And subsequent efforts, major efforts by the Chinese government that put tons of resources and also very strong policies in place have reduced pollution, PM2.5 levels at an annual average value by 42% since 2013, from 2013 to 2021, which is massive. Again, this one effort was not the only thing, but it was an accelerant that has provided tremendous benefits to the Chinese public in the past decade or so. So another example that I'm closer to is in Mongolia. Around 2011, 2012, I was in Mongolia working with colleagues at the National University of Mongolia, and we observed what was going on at the Beijing embassy, and we thought, well, why don't we just try to put up a monitor as well and see if there's an impact? Why not? And so we got some funding, I think on the order of maybe 10,000 USD to put up a monitor, to share that information on social media. Some students got involved and shared this information as well. And it had an outsized impact, especially when you consider 10K USD got national level eyes on the issue through the media. My Mongolian collaborator was invited to engage with the Mongolian parliament to talk about the role of data and science when it came to air pollution. One of the political narratives that predates that time was to blame China, which was extremely far away from Ulaanbaatar, the capital city, the Gobi's in between, for air pollution problems. So really, this centered the conversation around data and science. So again, outsized impact for honestly a very small project. And in the following years after that, there was momentum. And again, this project wasn't the only momentum, but it was an accelerant to improve the Mongolian government, to improve the way that it shared information, updating its website, creating more open access, and expanding its monitoring across the initially Ulaanbaatar and also the country. And then the third example I'll talk through is from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is slightly different. So a few years back, through previous work, held a workshop in Sarajevo that convened a variety of different groups from different sectors, all interested in air pollution. But there was someone from an air quality agency, so a government perspective. There was an activist working on environmental issues in Bosnia. There were people from think tanks. We had scientists from both in Sarajevo, but also in the Balkan region, who attended, and all had very different perspectives on air pollution. And they attended because there was a small amount of air quality data already available, and it was a convening lever for them to decide what could they do together as a group and with the existing data to advocate for. And so this group decided that they wanted to put together a community statement, not calling for more data, but actually calling for an update to Bosnia's regulations around PM10 and PM2.5 to match more closely with EU regulations. As it turned out, later, after they made this public, one of the participants went in front of the Bosnian parliament and presented this work on behalf of that entire group. And it had a lot more weight because it was not just from this one activist in this case, but it was from such a wide group of people who had come together to make this statement. Additionally, there was a couple attendees who worked together to launch the first field campaign, really bootstrapped it from nothing. The first field campaign of its type, measuring the emission sources and emission sources of various pollutants in Sarajevo. And it's first of its type since 1992, prior to the Bosnian War. And they've published multiple papers now in the past couple of years, and super powerful. That again, this effort probably cost $6K from memory, and well worth that outsized impact for capitalizing on that tiny bit of open data available there at the time. And changing up this perspective for a moment, just thinking about what the international level impact could be for a small sustained PM2.5 monitoring effort. Some of this I think is probably a little more tangible to scientific audiences, but absolutely filling PM2.5 data gaps is going to improve PM2.5 ground estimates derived from satellite products. And that's extremely valuable to the scientific community for various studies that this data flows into, for the global burden of disease, for the work that we do at EPIC as well, but also into national policy and international policy reports like the WHO and the UN. And additionally, there's a certain gravity that develops around a place when there's any data. When there's no data, it's hard for many researchers to have a way in to do work. But once there's this anchor data, which I've seen this at the State Department when the embassy program that monitored PM2.5 spread to various places, there's more incentive to start one additional research. So, you know, there's a reference grade instrument available and data from that instrument available publicly. Well, now you can launch, say, a low-cost sensor effort and have an instrument to calibrate against. So there's real value to that. And then thirdly, I think having filling these gaps helps reduce geographic bias in what we're calling global air quality analyses. I've seen several papers where they're doing their best attempt at a global air quality analysis, but in truth, when you look at the underlying data, it's largely global north, where the entire continent of Africa is often not well represented data. And that's a problem. And I think this will only become more of a problem as we're relying on AI to do analyses as well, where that underlying data can get hidden or sort of taken for granted. And it's really important to reduce that geographic bias as soon as possible. And then Randall Martin, I thought I'd close out this section with a quote from him. He's the lead of the Atmospheric Composition Analysis Group at the University of Washington at St. Louis. And he's done really foundational work in setting and providing PM2.5 ground estimates. He says, filling PM2.5 data gaps through sustained ground-based monitoring has immense potential, not only to evaluate and improve satellite-based estimates of PM2.5, but also to empower local stakeholders for clean air action. And so I think many of his colleagues agree. Back to this slide. And so here's the thought experiment. I think we're prepped for it. What national level impact could a small sustained PM2.5 monitoring effort have? Well, let's look at Guatemala, for example. Its annual PM2.5 levels are 6 times the WHO guideline at 29 or so micrograms per cubic meter. That's high. That's not as high as much of South Asia on an annual average basis. So it's high, but not the highest of countries. It has a population of 17.4 million. That's not, with the distribution of countries, that's a relatively small country. It does not have national air quality standards, and it does has some known government-produced air quality data, but it's not fully open. And the known outdoor air quality development funding in 2022, sourced from a recent report from Clean Air Fund and underlying data, was less than $23,000 for the entire country for the year 2022. So let's imagine, what if producing long-term PM2.5 data eventually led to Guatemala reaching the WHO interim 2 guideline of 25 micrograms per cubic meter for a sustained period of time. So that's just 4 micrograms per cubic meter less. That's why I picked the WHO interim 2 guideline. It was closest to it where it is. What would be the impact of that? So from an estimate we do at EPIC, this would add 0.4 years of added life expectancy for the average Guatemalan, equating to 6.8 million life years. There's different methodologies for calculating this. I think ultimately you'll get to the same rough answer, but also to put out there to anyone in the audience, would love to engage with others who do use those different methodologies to calculate something similar. And using that number, so a conservative estimate values these gains as worth 170 million USD per year in avoided health costs, which is quite a large number. And as a point of context, this tracks with a 2020 World Bank estimate using a different underlying methodology for the life expectancy calculation, where it found that 1.4 billion USD in health damages were due to PM2.5 levels in Guatemala in 2016. And so this was if you this calculation assumes like what the counterfactual is, what if the PM2.5 pollution were not an actual issue. So it takes out the full range, whereas here we were looking at just about a 14% reduction. So it tracks. So let's keep that 170 million USD per year in avoided health costs in our minds when we go to thought experiment 2. So what would it cost? This is a very naive question, but it's worth asking. What would it cost to fill PM2.5 data gaps across the world? So if we filled out 151 of these countries shown in either orange or light orange or dark orange, what if you provided funding for each of them to have a PM2.5 monitor? And let's assume an upper estimate, I would say, of 100,000 USD per year per group to do that work. So this would cost 15.1 million per year globally. Meanwhile, if we look back at that Guatemala example, the gains from a modest reduction in one small country would equate to more than 10 times the cost of that program. So I do not suggest one finds every single country here for many reasons, which we'll get into. But it's worth noting that if you funded all 151 countries without current sustained monitoring that produced open data and had just one Guatemala-sized success, the social reward would be more than 10 times the program's cost. And that truly is a golden opportunity for a funder out there to grab onto. And so for a lot of reasons, it doesn't make sense to fund each of those places. There's also, as we've said, clear funding limitations. So how should one prioritize that? And that's what we'll get into in this section. And the framing of this opportunity will be around where does a single well-supported PM2.5 monitoring effort have the highest probability for national level impact. And so, if you look at where we described data gaps before, this is not the US. The US is in gray. The marginal impact of a single monitoring effort is likely not to have a national level impact. It's also not China. First of all, China is on a downward trajectory for its pollution levels at a rate faster than I think any other country can claim they've done in history. Also, they have, while it's not fully open, they do have a very robust monitoring network. Probably if you launch a PM2.5 effort in China, it could have great impact, just like one could have in the US, but it's probably not going to have the highest probability for a national level impact. Same thing for India, huge air pollution problem that is persistent, but one monitoring effort due to the size of the existing monitoring network out there is not likely to have that national level impact. Again, to be very clear, I think there's many interesting and impactful projects one could deploy in the US, in China, or India. But for this definition of where a single well-supported PM2.5 monitoring effort could have the highest probability for national level impact, that's not where this is. So how do we capture that? Here's our attempt that I'll explain and walk through currently. So we're taking into account a variety of parameters. For example, what is the annual average PM2.5 value, a higher value in a given country? A higher value means there's greater opportunity. Is there an ambient annual PM2.5 standard? A lack of standards in this case means there's greater opportunity for a single effort to have that outsized impact. What are the number of or density of known government air quality monitors or non-government air quality monitors? What's the philanthropic funds or the development agency funds that are flowing through the country? Lower funding means there's potentially more opportunity for that marginal impact of a monitor, and several others. So we've converted this into an opportunity score. And so this is a country level metric that we're doing for every country in the world that estimates that potential opportunity in a given country. And again, part of the idea around this is to give the funding landscape country-size way of evaluating these opportunities. And so how it's calculated, for each of the 10 indicators that you'll see here in a moment, a country gets a score of 1 for each of them if it meets that country level data gap opportunity criteria. And then we sum up across those different indicators for a maximum score of 10. Here they are currently in their current state. And you'll see right now, this is our first cut. It's relatively simple to see how things fell out with this first cut. And you'll see these light gray boxes. Those indicate areas where we've incorporated data for those, but perhaps not fully yet, or some of these we have not yet incorporated, and so they're shown in light gray. And I'll also call out, this is an evolving product, and if you would like to check it out and offer feedback, we have a GitHub repo where we store this that's listed there, and you'll also see it on the next slide and at the end slide. And again, if you're interested in checking that out or contributing in some way, that'd be great. I also want to give a shout out to our data partners who are providing the data, underlying data for this, including Clean Air Fund and OpenAQ. So I'm going to give just a broad sense with this first cut of the opportunity score of example countries that are falling into some rough bands. Our report will list out the final opportunity score for each country in the world, along with a banding system. And the V1 data is already available at the repo, but should be used with caution as it is evolving. But here's what it looks like. So what we're getting out in this first cut is countries like South Korea, Austria, Estonia on the bottom there. Not likely golden opportunities, and that makes sense because they have a fairly robust resources to address air pollution, as you can see on the right-hand columns, and their pollution levels are relatively low. Meanwhile, you see in the high and medium countries like the DRC, Cameroon, Guatemala, where they're lacking more resources and have higher levels of pollution as well. So in the last bit of the talk, I want to talk about who will fill this data gap, and call out we are searching for local actors in PM2.5 data gap locations across the world to highlight in our report, as well as get an aggregate sense of what are they working on, what are their opportunities, and what are their barriers as well. So why local actors first? One, they're there for the long term. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. They know the political and social landscape better than anyone not local, typically, and have the best connections within the country, and also will often know what is feasible politically or socially in moving the dial on an air pollution issue. They can pass on knowledge to others locally, thereby building capacity and continuity for an issue, for the effort. And their mission is precisely aligned with achieving clean air where they are. As opposed to, say, for example, a researcher from abroad who's working on air pollution for their work, which has been me in the past, that is not precisely aligned with, say, achieving clean air in that country. It overlaps, and that researcher may have the best intentions, but it doesn't mean that their mission with their work is going to push 100% towards achieving clean air. So that's an important piece too. So to figure out both who is currently working in so-called data gap countries for PM2.5 and currently monitoring or could be well poised to do that monitoring, we've created a public registry. There's a QR code there and also the tiny URL to, again, highlight in our report as well. And I will say this more than once in the rest of the talk, but would really appreciate you sharing this with your network if you know others or yourself that may be located in a place where there's a lack of PM2.5 data. So I want to give, so we've had this registry up for a little bit, and I want to give a sense of who we're hearing from the registry so far. So we've had 70 responses so far from 32 countries shown in red here. And they're researchers, nonprofits, companies, informal entities. We haven't had any government respondents yet, though we're very open to that as well. You'll see there's how we're doing in overlap. You can see we do Latin America, we've gotten a pretty good response. Africa, we've gotten a fair number of countries, but there's a lot more countries we haven't heard from. Central Asia, we could use some help there, especially, and as well as in South and Southeast Asia. And so as we've gotten these respondents, FARA has been conducting interviews for case studies and again, getting that sense of aggregate experiences for our report. And we wanted to share a little bit of what we're hearing from local actors so far. So a sampling of the activities from Cote d'Ivoire. There's a non-air quality focused tech company that's set up a PM2.5 sensing effort that's entirely self-funded and really a social good side project they're doing because they just thought someone needs to fill this gap. In Bangladesh, there's a researcher who has previously set up air quality monitoring at a Rohingya refugee camp and is working to create a DACA-wide air quality network. And for context, Bangladesh is by annual average PM2.5 levels the most polluted country in the world. And then in Nigeria, we're hearing about a new large-scale air quality sensing project that's being launched in Lagos, fueled by air quality researchers from across multiple universities, which is super exciting. We're also hearing about challenges. So some of what we've heard so far, there's difficulty sharing their own data. So different sensor companies have their own dashboards, but they are only available for internal use and they can't share across systems. Academic systems that punish publishing too soon, which is, I think, something that's pretty common across academia, no matter where you are, to hear as a barrier for some. And someone has mentioned that the data as a service can be expensive to sustain doing over time to generate air quality data. I also have had difficulties accessing other good data. So either due to no or a low number of government or reference grade monitors or those may exist, but there's no data sharing publicly. We've also heard of some who have to pay for data. And funding and capacity limitations. So a lack of funds limiting procurement, but also limiting the ability to ensure maintenance and staff to do that work, as well as a lack of capacity. And a lack of funder focus. So we've heard funders get disinterested after a year or two. And in the air pollution world, if you want to achieve change, China achieving what it has over the course of 7 to 8 years has been amazing, but that's not a 2-year effort. That's a longer term effort. So that's well taken. And then interestingly, in terms of opportunity, what we've been hearing on average so far is that the amount of funds needed to charge up various local actor work over, say, the next year is on the average of 25 to 50K USD per group. And I'll note that's a quarter to half of what I'd cited for the naive total world estimate. So with that, our next steps is we're seeking to engage a variety of folks in this work this fall. So we'll be at the Air Sensors International Conference in Accra in Ghana. In a couple weeks, we'll be at the Better Air Quality Conference with a booth and a poster in Manila, Philippines in November. And then later on in November, we'll be at the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, Germany as well. And would love to engage with anyone who happens to be at any of those activities. And our report will be out in late 2023. Here's our ask to you. Again, would love your help in finding local actors in PM2.5 data gap countries. On the registry form, we've identified some gaps, but on the registry form, we're letting that be a self-identified call, and I think that's valuable. So if that's broadly defined. We want to hear feedback, putting my email address there, also the GitHub repo again as well. And then lastly, our ask is when the report is out, make some noise. Send me an email right now with the subject AQ Data Gaps report, and we'll be sure to send you the report when it's out. And one of the issues in the air quality space is there is just amazing people working on air pollution from every aspect, just with so much heart. But it's a small community, and it's getting ignored relative to the size of the problem it is. And we need to bring more people from different sectors and different walks of work and life in to help solve this issue. This picture on the right that you've seen throughout is supposed to represent the golden opportunities that filling these data gaps have, and I'll also, it's also hourglass, and time is of the essence. Even in the span of this talk, looking at the WHO estimate of number of people who have died per year due to PM2.5 pollution, that's 480 people during this talk alone. So it's an urgent issue that really needs us to shout as loudly as possible to make sure it's known and it gets supported, and the people doing this really important work locally get supported as well. So with that, thank you again for your time and this invitation to talk, and would love to take questions and discuss this.
So there's one question already from the talk. With the Chinese reduction in PM2.5, were they also reducing other pollutants at the same time?
Yeah, good question. I've only studied it from PM2.5 perspective, but I believe it must. It's very likely true, given some of the policies were to reduce or completely eliminate some coal-fired plants in certain locations. So I would assume PM10 also went down. I don't know though definitively, so I'll leave it there.
And there's a comment here that Mongolia is still selling the air quality data.
Yeah, we've heard this in several places. It's a symptom of a lack of support for air quality management in a given place. I've heard some countries do it out of a necessity to support what they're doing, and I think it doesn't happen when the resources are more adequate than they are.
And when their maps indicated many Central and West Asian countries don't invest enough for air quality, is there any attempts to motivate them, considering they are pretty rich countries?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think there's a case to be made, whether it is from philanthropy, from development agencies, or from governments themselves to address the issue. I think I don't know of specific attempts to motivate relatively rich countries to monitor, like say several Middle Eastern countries. It's a good question.
So Chuck's question is back up. He says PM2.5 concentrations can vary tremendously on local or at least sub-regional scales. Is there a role for these networks at very low cost, potentially poorly calibrated PM2.5 monitors such as Purple Air? And I guess also I had a follow-up question to Chuck. A lot of these sensors are installed outside or on the roof of a building, but in countries where there's a lot of indoor cooking over a fire, that's going to be where most of the exposure is going to be from. So how do you bridge that gap between where the sensors are and where people are being exposed?
I think that's a really good question. So first to Brock's question, I think there is a role. The way that I'm thinking one could potentially shape a fund to support this type of work is rather through, I think there's a capacity issue and a knowledge gap when it comes to low-cost sensors and what can and cannot be done. I think there's a place for low-cost sensing. I also think there's going to be cases in particular policy context within a country where low-cost sensors is going to make a lot of sense. And I think such a fund should accept proposals that allow that space. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think there's a role. Is it useful for everything and anything? And is it useful for a group that may not understand the limitations of low cost sensing? Less so. But I think for the right approach, it would be, and I think that should be fair game in, say, such a fund that might support local actors in doing their work. And I think there's more of a role, especially where you have, say, reference grade, whether it's government or others who are operating it, reference grade equipment to provide that calibration. But I think it takes it depends on the particular role. There's a group in Pakistan that put out air visual monitors. These are lower cost sensors as well. And, their work has gotten a lot of attention, I believe, all the way up to the national government level on, are these measurements right? Okay, well, now we need to put up a monitor to see if they're right. So that's that piece. Kyle, to your question, I think it's super good. I see this in the Gambia. So in the Gambia, the annual average ambient pollution is pretty low, but you go into a household and there's not many studies, but one was done over a 48-hour period where I want to say exposure was 200 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5, right? So there's a huge disconnect. I think if there's in a place with no ambient standards, that can be a first step, but I don't know what that route looks like exactly. Because, in the US, very different groups work on indoor air quality versus outdoor air quality. And there's a different regulation and really a lack of regulation for a lot of reasons. So I think it's an open question how that's addressed in places where the indoor air quality far exceeds the outdoor.
All right, well, let's thank Christa again for an excellent talk. She had her contact information, and if you missed that, reach out to either me or her, and we can get you more stuff. And then I think our next talk is next ACOM seminar is our next talk is in about a month by John Dennis from NCAR Sizzle. And with that, I will see you guys later. Thank you all.